Fear, for the German army, rarely came suddenly. It accumulated slowly, through patterns, reports, and the uneasy realization that an opponent was behaving in ways doctrine had not prepared them for. With George S. Patton, that fear did not begin on a battlefield where shells fell and tanks burned. It began in intelligence summaries, in intercepted radio traffic, and in after-action reports written by officers who struggled to explain why carefully planned defenses had unraveled with such speed. Patton's name appeared again and again, attached not just to defeats, but to confusion. German military culture prized structure, control, and predictability. Even in chaos, there was an expectation that battles followed a certain rhythm: attack, resistance, withdrawal, reorganization. Patton disrupted that rhythm. He refused to let battles settle. He denied his enemies the pauses they relied upon to regain balance. To German commanders trained to manage war as a system, Patton felt less like an opposing general and more like a force that refused to behave logically. Early encounters in North Africa planted the first seeds of anxiety. German units noticed that Patton's formations did not halt after success. Where other Allied commanders paused to consolidate ground, Patton advanced. He pushed his men forward while the enemy was still reeling, still reorganizing, still uncertain. This relentless momentum turned tactical victories into operational disasters for German forces, who found themselves retreating not by plan, but by necessity. What alarmed German officers most was not Patton's aggression alone, but his instinctive grasp of tempo. He seemed to understand that the true battlefield existed in time as much as space. By compressing decision-making cycles and forcing constant reaction, he denied German commanders the ability to shape events. Orders were always late. Reinforcements arrived too slowly. Plans were overtaken by movement before they could be executed. Patton's personal style amplified this effect. His speeches, his language, his cultivated image of inevitability were not random expressions of ego. They were tools. German intelligence analysts noted how his presence affected American morale and enemy expectations alike. Even when Patton's actual strength was limited, the belief that he commanded overwhelming force altered German behavior. Units prepared for attacks that never came, redeployed prematurely, or abandoned defensible positions out of fear of encirclement. As the war moved into Sicily and later France, this psychological pressure intensified. German commanders found that Patton's forces appeared where they were least expected, exploiting gaps before they could be sealed. Defensive lines drawn with care collapsed, not because they were weak, but because they were bypassed, outflanked, or rendered irrelevant by speed. The battlefield refused to remain static long enough for German doctrine to function. German soldiers at the front described encounters with Patton's units as exhausting rather than merely violent. There was no sense of predictable engagement. Attacks came in poor weather, at odd hours, through terrain others would avoid. This eroded confidence. Even well-trained troops began to feel hunted rather than engaged, reacting to movement rather than initiating it. Patton's insistence on relentless pursuit was particularly devastating. German doctrine often relied on controlled withdrawal, sacrificing ground to preserve combat power. Patton rejected this logic entirely. He pursued retreating units aggressively, forcing them to fight while moving, disrupting supply columns, and preventing the establishment of new defensive positions. What should have been orderly retreats turned into chaotic retreats under pressure. Intelligence failures compounded German anxiety. Patton's operational secrecy and deception efforts made it difficult to track his true intentions. Units were forced to prepare for multiple possibilities simultaneously, stretching already thin resources. This uncertainty created paralysis at higher command levels, where decisions depended on clarity that never fully arrived. By this stage of the war, German forces were already strained by shortages of fuel, manpower, and air support. Patton exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. His emphasis on speed transformed logistical shortages into strategic liabilities. German commanders understood that they could not afford prolonged engagements, but Patton ensured that engagements came whether they were ready or not. Even when Patton was not physically present on the battlefield, his reputation influenced German planning. Units adjusted their dispositions based on the possibility of his arrival. Reserves were held back or repositioned in anticipation of attacks that existed only in rumor. In this way, Patton exerted influence beyond his actual reach, shaping enemy decisions through fear rather than force. Within German command circles, Patton became a subject of debate. Some advocated concentrating forces to confront him directly. Others urged avoidance, believing that engaging Patton on his terms invited destruction. This lack of consensus reflected a deeper uncertainty. Patton defied categorization. He did not behave as the Americans were expected to behave. For Patton, this reaction was confirmation of a core belief. He believed that war could be shortened by breaking the enemy's confidence. Fear, when cultivated properly, forced mistakes. Mistakes accelerated collapse. Patton sought not only to defeat armies, but to dominate their decision-making process, leaving opponents perpetually one step behind. By the time Allied forces advanced deeper into Europe, Patton's name carried weight disproportionate to his actual command. German soldiers spoke of him as if he were everywhere at once, always advancing, always pressing. This perception mattered more than reality. It shaped behavior, distorted planning, and weakened resistance before shots were fired. And as this fear solidified, it set the stage for moments when German commanders would face a choice: stand and risk annihilation, or retreat and concede momentum. In that space between decision and action, Patton's true power, not merely as a general of tanks and troops, but as a commander who made fear itself an instrument of war, emerged, not merely as a general of tanks and troops, but as a commander who made fear itself an instrument of war. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Western Europe, German fear of Patton evolved from unease into anticipation. It was no longer a question of whether he would strike, but when and how violently he would disrupt what little stability remained. German commanders began to view Patton not as a single opponent, but as a destabilizing presence capable of unraveling entire sectors of the front simply by entering them. His arrival signaled acceleration, and acceleration was something German forces could no longer afford. Patton's operational philosophy clashed directly with German expectations of American command. German doctrine assumed that Allied forces, particularly American ones, would prioritize coordination, supply buildup, and overwhelming preparation before major actions. Patton inverted this logic. He acted first, then adjusted. This forced German commanders into a reactive posture where decisions were made under pressure rather than design, eroding their confidence and increasing the likelihood of error. The campaigns across France magnified this effect. Patton's Third Army advanced at a pace that defied German planning cycles. Defensive positions were identified, mapped, and reinforced, only to be bypassed entirely. German units found themselves isolated without having been decisively defeated, cut off from supply and support, and forced to surrender or retreat under constant threat. The battlefield became fluid in ways German commanders struggled to comprehend. German intelligence reports from this period reveal growing frustration. Attempts to track Patton's movements were undermined by rapid changes in direction, deceptive signals, and the sheer speed of his advance. Analysts warned that traditional indicators of enemy intent no longer applied. This uncertainty rippled upward, affecting strategic decisions at higher command levels, where incomplete information led to delayed or overly cautious responses. The fear Patton inspired was not rooted solely in defeat, but in the sense of inevitability he created. German soldiers described encounters where resistance seemed futile not because American forces were overwhelming, but because they never stopped coming. Even when attacks were repelled, Patton's units regrouped and struck again from unexpected directions. This persistence wore down morale, replacing confidence with resignation. Patton's emphasis on initiative empowered his subordinate commanders in ways that alarmed German planners. Lower-level American officers acted decisively, exploiting fleeting opportunities without waiting for permission. This decentralization made Patton's forces difficult to predict or counter. German units accustomed to exploiting hesitation found none. Every gap was used. Every delay was punished. The psychological toll of this style was profound. German soldiers reported constant anxiety, unsure whether quiet meant safety or imminent attack. Defensive preparations became exhausting rituals repeated without confidence. Sleep deprivation, compounded by uncertainty, degraded performance. Patton, whether consciously or not, had transformed the enemy's mental state into a vulnerability. German commanders attempted to counter this by consolidating forces and stiffening resistance at key points. These efforts often backfired. Concentrations became targets for Patton's mobile forces, which bypassed strong points and struck at rear areas, severing communication and supply lines. The result was not decisive engagement, but fragmentation, a slow disintegration of coherence. Even Patton's mistakes contributed to his mystique. When his forces overextended or encountered stiff resistance, German commanders hesitated to exploit these moments fully, fearing traps or sudden counterattacks. Patton's reputation for aggressive response made caution seem safer than opportunity. In this way, his past actions shaped future enemy behavior in his favor. At higher levels of German command, Patton was increasingly viewed as a symbol of Allied intent. His presence suggested not just local attack, but broader strategic movement. This perception distorted decision-making, drawing attention and resources toward Patton even when other threats were equally dangerous. Fear narrowed focus, and narrowed focus bred vulnerability elsewhere. Patton understood this effect intuitively. He believed that forcing the enemy to guess, and guess wrong, was as valuable as destroying divisions. Speed, unpredictability, and relentless pressure served this purpose better than methodical destruction. He sought not to outfight the enemy at every point, but to unbalance them everywhere. As the war dragged on, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to recover from Patton's blows. Losses that might once have been absorbed now became irreparable. Retreats meant abandoning equipment that could not be replaced. Every mile conceded weakened their capacity to resist the next advance. Patton's tempo accelerated this downward spiral. German soldiers began to speak of Patton with a mixture of resentment and respect. He was admired for his effectiveness even as he was feared. This acknowledgement reflected a grim professionalism. They recognized a commander who understood war on its harshest terms and was willing to impose those terms relentlessly. By late 1944, Patton's reputation had become an operational factor in its own right. Decisions were shaped not only by his actual movements, but by assumptions about what he might do next. This anticipation often proved more damaging than his actions themselves. Fear filled the gaps where intelligence failed, and as German commanders faced mounting pressure from all directions, Patton represented the embodiment of Allied momentum. He was the reminder that time was no longer their ally, that every delay only hastened collapse. The fear he inspired was not irrational. It was grounded in experience, reinforced by loss, and sustained by the relentless reality that wherever Patton appeared, stability disappeared soon after.
By the final months of the war, German fear of Patton had moved beyond strategy and into inevitability. His presence no longer represented a specific threat that could be countered or planned around. Instead, it symbolized the collapse of control itself. Wherever Patton's forces appeared, the front ceased to behave predictably. Lines dissolved, reserves vanished, and decisions made hours earlier became obsolete before they could be carried out. German commanders increasingly understood that Patton's greatest weapon was not his armor or his artillery, but his refusal to allow the battlefield to stabilize. War under Patton never paused long enough for recovery. Even after costly engagements, his forces pressed forward, denying the enemy the psychological relief that comes with survival. This relentless forward motion eroded the confidence that sustained resistance. The contrast between Patton and other Allied commanders became stark. Where others consolidated, Patton pursued. Where others measured, Patton accelerated. German officers adapted their expectations accordingly, often diverting forces preemptively when Patton's movements were suspected. This defensive anticipation drained resources and weakened positions elsewhere, amplifying the effect of Allied pressure across the front. Patton's impact extended beyond direct engagements. German units withdrew sooner when facing him, choosing preservation over confrontation. This behavior, rational in isolation, compounded the collapse of defensive depth. Territory was surrendered not because it was indefensible, but because fighting Patton seemed futile. Fear shortened resistance and hastened retreat. Even within German high command, discussions about Patton carried an undertone of resignation. Reports acknowledged his effectiveness while lamenting the impossibility of countering his tempo under existing conditions. Shortages in fuel, air cover, and manpower left little room for adaptation. Patton exploited these weaknesses not through brute force alone, but through constant motion that turned scarcity into crisis. Patton's understanding of psychological warfare was instinctive. He cultivated a reputation that magnified every action. Loud proclamations, aggressive posturing, and unapologetic confidence reinforced the image of a commander who would never slow down. German intelligence absorbed this image and fed it back into planning, often reinforcing the very fear Patton intended to create. At the tactical level, German soldiers felt this pressure acutely. Defensive positions were manned with the knowledge that delay, not victory, was the best outcome. This mindset altered behavior, reducing initiative and increasing passivity. When contact was made, units often disengaged sooner, unwilling to endure the sustained pressure they associated with Patton's advance. Patton's ability to inspire similar urgency among his own forces deepened the disparity. His soldiers believed in movement as survival. They advanced not only because they were ordered to, but because stopping felt more dangerous than pressing on. This shared belief created cohesion under extreme stress, allowing Patton's units to maintain momentum when others might have stalled. The fear Patton inspired also distorted German decision-making in subtle ways. Opportunities to counterattack were missed, not because they were impossible, but because commanders hesitated, uncertain whether Patton had already anticipated them. This hesitation proved fatal. War punished doubt as harshly as error, and Patton thrived in the space doubt created. As Allied victory became inevitable, Patton's reputation hardened into legend. German officers writing after the war acknowledged his role with a mixture of respect and bitterness. They recognized a commander who understood the fragility of morale and exploited it ruthlessly. Patton had not simply defeated them, he had outpaced them. Yet this fear carried a paradox. The very qualities that made Patton terrifying to the enemy also made him difficult for allies to manage. His impatience, his bluntness, and his refusal to moderate intensity clashed with the demands of coalition warfare and post-war politics. The same force that shattered German confidence complicated Allied unity. For Patton, this tension was inescapable. He was shaped by war and thrived within it. His methods were designed for moments when hesitation meant disaster. As the war ended, the environment that had made him indispensable began to disappear. Fear, once a weapon, became a liability in a world seeking stability. The German fear of Patton, then, was not simply fear of defeat. It was fear of a man who imposed a pace they could not match, a commander who denied them the dignity of recovery or the comfort of predictability. He represented a form of warfare that consumed time, morale, and control all at once. For the viewer, this story invites reflection. Was Patton feared because he was uniquely brilliant, or because circumstances aligned with his temperament? Would such a commander thrive in every war, or only in those defined by movement and crisis? These questions linger because Patton's legacy resists simple answers. In the end, the Germans feared Patton not merely for what he destroyed, but for what he denied them: the ability to adapt, to recover, and to believe that survival was anything more than a temporary delay. In that denial lay his true power, a power rooted not in cruelty or chance, but in an unyielding understanding of how fear shapes the fate of armies. True power, a power rooted not in cruelty or chance, but in an unyielding understanding of how fear shapes the fate of armies.